So this is a picture of Olympic National Park, which is a few hours away from where I live in the northwest corner of the USA. And I went there with a good friend of mine that I'd known for a long time. And it sort of was a capstone of several years of learning about hiking and camping. I grew up in the southeastern United States, which if you know anything about that other than Disney World, you would know that it's extremely hot and humid there pretty much all year round. And so going outside on purpose is a really bad idea for longer than a few minutes unless you're at a beach. So when I moved to Portland, I spent a lot of time learning about hiking and camping, which you guys have all kinds of nature around, so that probably seems really weird to have to learn about hiking and camping. But I had to sort of start from scratch as an adult and figure out this whole process. And it was a little overwhelming at first. I was talking to a lot of people and having to buy all this gear and understand all these survival techniques and things like that, taking classes. But eventually, somebody said something that made it really click for me, which was essentially that hiking and camping is just sort of a decision tree. As a programmer, that made a lot of sense to me, that there's just sort of a flow chart of questions that I needed to ask myself when I was planning for a trip. Like, how many days do I want to go? Is there a water source nearby? What kind of food do I want to bring? And that really helped me. And so I spent the next few years doing a lot of backpacking and camping and hiking, and I really enjoyed it. And having that process to step through and ask myself questions in order to make plans is what really helped me do that. And so I'm sort of using that as a way to transition, and I've had the same experience with migrating from AngularJS to Angular. How many of you are stuck in AngularJS, or maybe have, we were just talking earlier, moving, actually quite a few of you. Yeah, so that's helpful. It's funny because it's not a super popular conference topic, but everywhere I go, there's still tons of people who are in the migration process and are slogging their way through, and I totally empathize, and that's why I'm here. So I'm going to talk to you today about how to find the right path from AngularJS to Angular. So I'm Sam Julien. I'm a Angular and Web Technologies GDE. I work for Auth0 as a content engineer. We're an identity as a service platform. And I created the course upgradingangularjs.com, which is a comprehensive course about ng upgrade. And this is a picture of me on a survival trip in southern Oregon, where we spent 4 days and basically slept under tarps that we had made and braved the snow, and it was quite an experience. During this talk, I'm gonna refer to two example companies that are based on my own experiences. We're gonna have Noble Nonprofit and Stable Insurance, and these are based on either my own work experiences or other companies that I've talked to throughout my travels. Before we continue, though, I'm going to just go ahead and get two assumptions out on the table since we have a limited amount of time. First, I'm going to make the assumption that you've already decided that you need to migrate. There are good reasons to stay on AngularJS, mostly that you're not doing any new feature development, but we don't really have time to cover all of that right now. I'm also going to go ahead and assume that you're going to migrate to Angular and not to another framework, such as React or Vue. There are also good reasons to debate about whether to stick with Angular or go to another framework. But we're at Angular Finland, so I'm going to assume that we're all going to go with Angular. So if you want to talk to me about either of these topics, feel free. So first, let's talk about the 4 paths of migration that are generally accepted among the community. There's the rewrite path, ng upgrade, hybrid routing, and Angular elements. So Axel gave me a great lead-in to my talk. That was really convenient, given that he's just changed our entire conception of the World Wide Web. So first is the rewrite path, and this is also known as burn everything to the ground and start over. That's a great one. There's also ng upgrade. ng upgrade is a library written by the Angular team that essentially lets you run both AngularJS and Angular at the same time. The third path is called hybrid routing, and there's actually sort of part A and part B to hybrid routing. Part A actually still uses ng-upgrade, and it's client-side hybrid routing. So you'll have the router outlet for AngularJS and the router outlet for Angular running side by side, and essentially each route is purely in one of the frameworks. So they don't really interact as much. Whereas what I normally refer to as the ng-upgrade path, the two frameworks are very tightly coupled. You're mingling the dependency injection and the change detection systems in a way where both frameworks really know about each other. There's also server-side hybrid routing, which is where you essentially have two applications, and depending on the route, the server is sending either your AngularJS application or your Angular application. So both of those are valid depending on your use case. And then the last one is Angular Elements, and this one is picking up steam throughout the community, especially once Ivy comes. I think it's going to pick up even more steam as a viable option for migrating from AngularJS to Angular. And I won't explain too much about Angular Elements since we just had a fabulous talk about it. So there's two broad categories for determining which of these paths to take, because you might be sitting there thinking like, okay, this is great, but I mean, how do I actually know which of these things to do? So this is going to break down into your team and your code base. And I'm going to start with your team. And that might seem a little counterintuitive because, you know, we mostly talk about code. We don't really talk too much about people. But unfortunately, there are no robots to migrate your application for you. It's just not a thing. People actually have to do this work. So whoever you're working with is going to make a huge difference in how you migrate and when you migrate. And there are three factors that we need to take into account here. We need to take into account the size of your team, right? How many people are actually working with you on this project? And do you have any ability to bring on any outside consultants, or is it going to be purely in-house and up to you to migrate? So for example, at the nonprofit, they've got 4 developers that are working on 2 medium applications that are, you know, fairly complex. They're not just to-do apps. But because they're a small team, they coordinate a lot amongst themselves, and they work together on projects. And the problem is that because they're small and they're a nonprofit, they don't really have any opportunity to bring in outside consultants or anything. This whole migration process is going to be up to these 4. The insurance company, on the other hand, is a huge organization. They've got 70 developers just on their AngularJS side, managing 8 large applications. And because they're such a big group, they need a high degree of autonomy. They can't be like checking with each other for every commit and walking across the building to talk to each other about everything. They have to be able to have a lot of automation and a lot of things that are scalable. But on the bright side, because they're an insurance company with a lot of resources, they could bring in outside consultants to help make this process a little bit easier for them. And next we want to think about capacity. So how much time do you have to devote during each development cycle to this technical debt? Because that's really what migration is, right? It's just a massive amount of technical debt that you need to work through. So, for example, at the nonprofit, they're a small group and they're very flexible. They have a lot of control over what their schedule is like. So they've decided that they're going to devote 30% of their time to technical debt, which leaves 60% to feature development and 10% to production support and bugs. Now you might be thinking, that's a lot, 30%, like who has that? But it is out there, and it can be really good, but the problem is that ends up being a lot of time spent on this tedious refactoring, and so there is a little bit of a danger of burnout there where you might be spending so much time refactoring legacy code that you kind of lose your mind. The insurance company, on the other hand, I don't know how it is over here, but in the States, these big companies, these kinds of decisions get made way up at the top of the food chain, and down in the basement where most developers live in these big companies, they don't really get a say in how much time they get to spend doing their work. So the insurance company has 10% of their sprint to devote to technical debt, no more, no less. And that's kind of a bummer, but at the same time, they're such a big group that they do have the ability to share the work amongst themselves. So it might even out in that sense. And then the third factor for the team is the level of experience. And here, I'm talking about two different things. So, of course, what we would naturally think of would be the years of experience, or whether the person is a junior developer or a senior developer or an architect. But in addition to that, we also need to think about the expertise of the team members. Because, unfortunately, AngularJS and Angular do have quite a lot of differences, especially when you introduce RxJS and observables and reactive programming. There is quite a lot to digest, and you have to take that into account as you're planning your migration process. So at the nonprofit, they've got 2 seniors, a mid-level developer, and a junior developer. And of those, one of them is an Angular developer, one of them is an AngularJS developer, and 2 of them are actually back-end C# developers that are just there to pitch in and help out and learn the front end. And of course, which experience level goes with which expertise makes a big difference, right? So we would want to take that into account. On the other hand, the insurance company, they've got a wide range of experience as far as juniors all the way up to architects, but they're pretty much all AngularJS developers. That's what their department is. That's what they do day in and day out. And so both of these companies are going to have to take some training into account and figure out how to increase their knowledge of Angular and build that into their time that they're spending on this project. So, knowing what we know so far, how would we advise these 2 companies in making their decisions? So we've got the 4 migration paths, and the nonprofit right now, they're a small team, they have a lot of capacity, they have a lot of control over what they're doing. So they're leaning towards either rewriting or using the ng upgrade library to do this migration on their applications. The insurance company, they're still a little in the dark about what to do. They know that they don't have the time for a big rewrite, but they're really not sure about the other 3 migration paths. So how do we help these companies narrow it down? And that's where we would actually come to what we would expect in a talk like this, which would be the code base. And when we talk about the code base, some of this will be broad for multiple applications, and some of them will be on a specific application basis, but you'll get a sense of it with your own code base. The first category would be architecture, and I'm using architecture as a very broad term here to encompass quite a number of concepts, but the too long didn't read of it is basically how modern is your AngularJS app. If you think of AngularJS as a spectrum and go back all the way to back in 2012, 2013, all the way to today, you might remember code that looks like something like this, where we've got our folders are things like controllers, directives, and factories, and you can see that there's no iffy immediately invoked function expression around the code, which was standardized later. There's there's a lot of $scope in there. There's a lot of array syntax. And to those of you who only work in Angular, you are very fortunate to not understand what I'm talking about. But this is how it looked back in the day, and it was pretty frustrating. So if your code is like this means you're going to have a lot of preparation to get to Angular, or you're going to need to skip the preparation altogether and come up with another solution. On the other hand, if your code is very modern, using component architecture and not using $scope anymore, and using AngularJS 1.6 or 1.7, that's going to heavily influence what you're able to do. So for example, the nonprofit, they've been seeing this coming for a couple of years. So they've been gradually moving their code over to be more compliant with the John Papa style guide. They've been using component architecture, they've been using AngularJS 1.6, so they're pretty on top of things. They're using classes for their services, but on the other hand, the insurance company, as is often the case at big companies, they have this whole wide range of old practices. They're using AngularJS 1.2, they've got $scope everywhere, they've got shared libraries that are using different versions of Angular. It's, as referring to John Papa again, it's spaghetti code, and it's difficult to refactor. And that's going to influence what these companies are able to do. The next big topic would be the build process. And by the build process, we also need to think about if there even is a build process. We're so used to things like the CLI and Webpack now that we often forget about the times where we just had index.html that listed 25 scripts that all had to be included in the page. But this actually still exists. Many of you are nodding along, and so you understand. And so with the build process, there's two things that we need to take into account. We want to look at the language that you're using, and we want to look at the build process that you're using. So on the language side of things, how close are you to getting to TypeScript? Are you using vanilla ES5? Are you using ES 2015 with something like Babel to transpile? Or are you using TypeScript? And then from the build process side, are you already using something like Webpack or the CLI? And if not, what's the best path to get there? So you want to think that through. If you can use the Angular CLI right off the bat in your migration, that's fantastic. Otherwise, you might need a custom Webpack build. So the nonprofit, like we said, they've seen this coming. They're using Gulp, the task runner Gulp, as their build process. They're using ES 2015 with Babel, and their build process is fairly standard. You know, they've got concatenation and minification and all those buzzwords. And they're basically using what would have been a very modern build process around 2014. And this is very common. I see this all the time. Gulp, Babel, standard build process. On the other hand, the insurance company, they're sort of a little bit before that. Many of their applications are using script tags. They've got a couple of their applications using Grunt as a task runner. They never made it to Gulp. But they're using all ES5. They haven't gone down the transpilation path at all. And this is very common with a lot of heavily regulated industries, at least it is over in the States. They're very slow to adopt new technologies because they have to go through a lot of security checks and make sure everything is kosher and secure. And as you might imagine at a company like that, their build process has to be fairly complex because of the security checks that they have to have. So these two companies will have to look, whereas the nonprofit might be able to adopt the CLI very quickly, whereas the insurance company might need to look at a custom Webpack build. But both of them will have to transition to TypeScript at some point. And then the last topic is testing, which I know we all love testing. How many of you actually love testing? I'd be curious. Nice. That's good. That's the way to be. Yeah. How many of you actually write tests? Oh, wow. You are way more responsible. I think if I asked that question in America, it would be like 1 out of 10 people. We don't like testing. We don't do testing. I don't know. Maybe it's me. I don't know. But testing in the migration story is actually very important because, especially if you're using ng-upgrade, you've got 2 dependency injection systems and 2 change detection systems. And so when you're using something like Karma to mock that, it can be a little bit messy. So when we talk about testing, as you probably know, we've got unit testing and end-to-end testing. So in the unit testing side, we're most likely talking about Karma and Jasmine. Although in Angular now we have the opportunity to use Jest by Facebook, which is a really cool unit testing framework. But Karma in particular has a lot of problems dealing with the mixed dependency injection and the mixed change detection systems. And that can be a big pain. So my recommendation is always, if you're using ng-upgrade, to test only the pure Angular and the pure AngularJS and leave the hybrid stuff alone until you get that stuff moved over, because it's kind of a nightmare, I'm not gonna lie. On the end-to-end side, you have a similar problem with Protractor. Protractor, you might know, hooks into AngularJS or Angular and is very aware of what your code is doing. And so oftentimes I've seen people have to switch over to Cypress, which instead spins up your application and runs it through a browser and tests it. And to me, that's sort of a more, it makes more sense as an end-to-end testing because I don't see why an end-to-end tester would need to know what the code is doing underneath. So at the nonprofit, they've got a number of unit tests, but most of their stuff is all internal. So if their unit tests are failing for a temporary period of time, the world isn't going to end. They do have some protractor tests, but nothing too critical. In other words, the nonprofit isn't dependent on testing, whereas the insurance company is heavily dependent. They have public-facing products, and so they have lots of unit tests, lots of protractor tests. And I actually encountered a company that had gone down one migration path only to realize that they couldn't get their test to pass, and they had to revert and go back. Whereas if they had thought ahead and realized how critical the testing story was for them, they would have started out at a different path. So if we put all this together and we have the two companies, the nonprofit is essentially the perfect use case for NG Upgrade, because it's a medium application with a small team that has a lot of control over what they're doing, and they can afford to be in a sort of code purgatory state for a little while. Whereas the insurance company, they really can't afford to have that kind of downtime or sort of unstable time. So they really need to be more looking at the hybrid routing options and Angular elements that's going to give them a little bit more flexibility in how they approach everything. So I hope that's helpful. I've got a few extra resources for you as I wrap up here. The first two are by Alana Olson, who was an intern at Google last summer. Hopefully she'll be an intern again. She created something called the NG Migration Assistant, which is a command line tool that will let you analyze your legacy code and spits out some recommendations for you. That's a great one. She also created the Migration Wiki and Forum, which is a place you can submit issues and find resources and tools and people to help with your migration. Of course, my own course, Upgrading AngularJS, that's specific to the NG Upgrade story. It doesn't cover the other migration paths. But, and then I'll leave you with these few articles on the other paths from folks like Manfred Steyer and Victor Savkin. These are great resources on the other paths. And don't worry, all of this is available. If you go to samj.im/Finland, it'll take you to a page where you can get the slides and the notes and all of that good stuff. And you can follow me on Twitter and talk to me anytime. Since I'm a GDE, I'm here for the community. I love the NG community all around the world, and I'm happy to answer questions and point you in the right direction. So thank you so much for your time and attention.